What happens when forbidden lores wake a sleeping god? Beneath a sun, the color of rust, the world of Virnex 9 smoldered like a wound the galaxy had long forgotten. Cities of blackened basalt and glass hunched along fissures that hissed with subterranean steam. The air tasted faintly of ozone and old prayers. Where the Administratum's map once recorded a thriving hive, now only thin bands of scavengers and sanctioned archaeologists threaded through the ruins, picking bones of industry from the skeleton of a forgotten era. For 30 standard years, the planet had been quarantined, its warp signature irregular enough to make even the most daring astropath hesitate. The quarantine was not ignorance. It was a decision made in the trembling light of councils and the cold calculus of risk. A detachment of the Ordo Xenos, small, surgical, and severe, had been dispatched under the authority of an inquisitor named Aurelia Voss. She was a woman whose reputation stitched together rumor and truth, a litany of uncompromising edicts, salvaged victories, and rumors of bargains struck in the spaces between duty and desperation. Her retinue moved like a shadow court across the ash, servo skulls drifting, a single sanctioned psyker, flanked by armored interrogators. A tech priest with a pack of humming relics that tasted the world in unitary vibrations. They came for a thing that no ledger could justify. A ledge of stone in the ruins where by scavenged testimony and a fissure of astropathic feedback, a library of forbidden lore had been buried beneath the tectonic bones of the city. Forbidden lore takes many names and many masks. Some find it as threads of sigil and equation woven into machine glyphs, blueprints that seem to sing if you look at them for too long. Others find it as insistent whispers in the gears of broken cogitators, as if the memory of a pre-imperial mind brushed human thought and left a stain. Voss knew those things. She had read reports smudged by acid, decrypted transmissions that had tasted of madness, and seen in the darkened vaults of other worlds, images that unlatched a small, precise terror in the sternum, knowledge that promised salvation at the price of becoming unmade. On the day they breached the vault's threshold, the sky was a sheet of dull pewter. Aurelia's lamp visor traced glyphs stamped across the stone, a language that was not quite machine, not quite Xeno, and yet older than both. Her fingers, gloved in ceramite, brushed the first tablet. It did not burn, it observed. A low hum gathered in the metal throat of a nearby servitor, a song that pulled at the edges of the psyker's mind. He closed his eyes and tasted not words, but architecture. Spirals of intent, a lattice of promises, built to hold something that slept. They called it an archive because humanity grasps at things by naming them. The archive lay like a cavern of bones, shelves carved from the living rock, plates of alloy and bone stacked in geometries that made the back of Voss's neck crawl. The tech priest, his augmetic eyes stained with condenser dust, fed a lamp into the mouth of an open tome shelf. And what spilled out was not light, but a pattern. The pattern wrapped itself around the retinue's synaptic receptors and probed with a politeness it did not intend. Voss felt memory creep under the skin of her decisions. Choices she had not yet made, doors she had not yet opened, like a hand that adjusted the fit of a glove. They worked at the archive with instruments that were faithful to the present and ignorant of the past. Data scribes translated diagrams into glyph plane for the Inquisition's eyes. Samples were taken, cataloged, and wrapped in oath linen. The team spoke in curt, efficient phrases, though each phrase carried the weight of council's silence. When they brought the first plate to the light, the sky itself seemed to inhale. There were warnings embedded in the text, of course, sparse, laconic, and maddeningly polite. "Do not rouse the sleeper," read one fragment. The tech priest's fingers, oily and reverent, traced the sentence and then hesitated, his augmetic lenses whirring as they sought clarity. Around them, the ruins waited, patient as a buried animal. The tempter logic of the archive was simple and elegant. Here is a thing that can turn attention into architecture. Here is a method to bind thought to being. In the wrong hands, it could craft a god. In the right hands, it might finally unmake the things that haunted humanity's borders. They did not have the right hands. No one does, thought Voss, and the thought stuck in her like a shard. The psyker's forehead sweat with concentration. Her lip quivered as images passed through her mind. In a voice that was something between a prayer and a machine call, Lear spoke the first word aloud, an act that had the inevitability of someone striking a tuning fork. It was a whisper, and yet it traveled through the archive and touched something wrapped under the planet's skin. For a time, nothing notable happened. Dust motes swam in the beam of Aurelia's lamp. The servitors ticked like small metronomes. A distant tremor, commonplace on Vernex 9, made the shells shiver. Then, beneath all measurable tremors, something like a slow, deliberative breath uncoiled through the stone. The glyphs on the plate responded, flaring with a faint inner light, not unlike the eyes of an ancient machine. It was as though attention itself had been pried open, and a thread extended into the dark. Aurelia felt the extension in the marrow of her bones. The planet shifted, not in tectonic terms, but in the alignment of intent. Where once Vernex 9 slumbered, now something beneath its skin opened a single, patient eye. No gore, no flash of violent spectacle, only the universe tilting a fraction toward a possibility that would not have been possible had the archive remained silent. Outside, in the ash and ruin, a cultist watcher, part scavenger, part religious opportunist, felt the change and fell to her knees with a smile that was equal parts worship and terror. Within the archive, Lear's lips moved, and the words she spoke were not wholly hers. They were older. They were offered as keys and as coaxing. And in their sound, there was the terrible gentleness of something that understands patient hunger. Aurelia closed her eyes. She had sworn to keep the Imperium safe from the things that prey upon the mind. She had sworn other things too, oaths that no one could hold without losing some small measure of warmth. Now, in the stale white of an oubliette that remembered stars, she understood what had been set into motion. A design that sought attention, and a cosmos that had prepared to give it. Down in the rock, the sleeping god rolled, as if adjusting to the intrusion. Its movement was not a roar, but a realignment, an economizing of forces, like a tidal shift in the architecture of thought. The first tendril of its influence was not a fist, but a whisper that crept into the psyker's dreams and laced itself around her resolve. It promised knowledge in exchange for custody of her sight. It promised absolution for the Inquisition's small failures, if they would only listen, if they would only let it speak. Voss felt the compulsion like static across her vows. She had a blade at her hip and a legion of law behind her, but there are bridges that weapons cannot cross. The archive had offered one such bridge, and a half-dozen human decisions had already leaned towards stepping across. In the distance, an astropathic choir at the Inquisition's listening posts will later record a single, aberrant tone, an overlay on the expected noise of the void. It would be measured and filed under anomalous. For now, though, the moment held cold and bright like a blade of glass. The world had been touched. The slave architecture of attention had been nudged awake, and someone, something, was taking its first careful survey of being. Aurelia turned her head and looked at Lear. The young psyker's eyes, when they opened, reflected a horizon that was not wholly human. For the smallest, most terrible instant, Aurelia believed she saw the shape of a promise and the shape of a debt, folded together like a sigil. She had, in a lifetime of judgment, kept many secrets. This secret whispered to her with the voice of something that had been waiting a very long time to be attended. The archive had not yet made itself a god. It had only begun to gather worship around the shape of a thought. Yet thought, once organized, becomes architecture, and architecture endures. Voss felt the first fracture of certainty. Somewhere in the planet's core, something responded to the invitation. It stirred like a thing stretching after a long sleep, and with an economy that belied its scale, extended an inquiry outward through the lattice of the archive. Who will watch? She understood, with an old and weary clarity, that the question did not invite a single answer. The wrong answer would bring ruin. The right answer might bring a different ruin. Either way, the world had shifted, and the small human players in its drama had been given no time to choose. They had already chosen by the mere act of listening. The archive had been touched. The sleeper had been coaxed. The eyes below opened wider. They sealed the mouth of the vault with chains that shivered against stone. But chains never bind an idea. Voss felt that now, like a physical knowledge lodged behind her ribs. The archive's first reach had become the planet's first breath in decades, and breath carries contagion. Outside the quarantine line, the ash plain undulated with small lives. Scavengers traded relics at a distance from the red marker. Children danced at the edges of radiation-lit gutters. Farther still, in a clump of rusted towers that had once housed factory foremen and hymn-chanting clerks, a sermon began without a preacher. A woman named Mavra, who had once bartered staters for water, woke from a dream with the taste of iron and a pattern behind her eyelids. When she pressed her palm to a broken cog, the cog answered with a small, precise alignment, and she laughed as if a door had been opened. The influence traveled along a tension like oil along a wick. Where the archive offered architecture, the world offered receptors. A miner paused mid-shift and watched his drill hum. He stared until the drill's cadence became a language, and then, without knowing the meaning, mouthed the syllables. In a remote hab, a child's toy servitor pivoted to face the wall and hummed a lullaby none could translate. The tune threaded through the net of radios the scavengers used, picked up by crude loopers, and repeated like a prayer. Back in the vault, the tech priest's reverence curdled into appetite. His servitor hands trembled as he unrolled another plate. His vocalizer filled the space with mechanical oaths, blessings to the machine god, which felt suddenly narrow and insufficient. The new glyphs promised something more, a communion of pattern that would free the cogitator from base instruction and allow it to dream. For an adept who had watched manufactorums die and their machine spirits starve, the prospect was a feed bowl to a famished god. He toyed, quietly, with the moral calculus of a man who had no children to feed, but a dozen dying reliquaries to resurrect. Lear's visions deepened. Where she had once seen single images, doors, scales, the library's lattice, she began to feel whole architectures of thought, nested like matryoshka shells. The sleeper did not shout across the world. It sang single tuned notes, and those who listened learned to sing back. Lear spoke less of her inner sight and more in the quiet panic of someone trying not to drown in a memory she had not yet made. When she touched the plate again, her fingers left a smear of luminal residue that the tech priest cataloged with feverish thoroughness. Aurelia watched them all with the same patient cruelty that had kept her alive through tribunals and betrayals. She was not untempted. The archive's promises pricked at the private ledger behind her breast. Lost sons, failed sieges, names she could not save. She understood what the archive could do to the Imperium. Not simply a weapon of fire and blade, but a thing that could rearrange the minds of whole worlds until they bent to a single, efficient will. The idea appalled her. It also terrified her with its usefulness. Orders came through the comlink like rain on a tin roof. Immediate containment. Evacuate non-essential personnel. Await further instruction. Commands from the Inquisition are rarely blunt. They are a calculus of implication. The phrase, await further instruction, is both a cord and a guillotine. Voss obeyed with the same mechanical clarity she apportioned to lesser duties. But obedience was a stage, not a state. She queued reports for transmission, but the quarantine field jittered as if some unseen instrument were testing its edges. The signal that left Vinex 9 carried with it a sound that the astropathic nets in the vortex translated as an anomaly, an overlapping cadence that made several choir boys at a listening post cry out into the void. News travels in degrees and compromises. A nearby manufactorum, isolated but not wholly cut off, began to record anomalous output in one of its cogitator cores, an echo that recorded vast, impossible proofs about pattern binding and attention synthesis. The manufactorum's overseer, an ex-Iron Priest turned manager, reported the anomaly as a systems fault. He also sent, in private, a short encrypted plea for a second opinion. The plea arrived at the Inquisition, a whisper long after its author had been reassigned to prayer. And at the same time, the Red Marker's outer band sent a scavenger with a homemade radio into the doomed night, chasing a song he believed would pay for his child's ration. Voss convened a council in the vault, because councils are how the Inquisition distributes responsibility and how individuals multiply the capacity for sin. The tech priest argued for extraction and reverse engineering. "We can fold the pattern into our servitors," he said, voice low and sharp. "We can create an engine that will help the Mechanicum leap centuries." The psyker, hollow-eyed and trembling, spoke of thresholds and the wrong way to open a mind. "It wants to be attended to," she whispered, "but attention becomes a scaffold. We build a throne when we look too long." Her words settled like iron filings. Outside, a cult of convenience formed around the radio scavenger song. They called themselves the Woken, and their doctrine was simple: listen, and the world will answer. They were not yet organized, only a throbbing of hunger and hope. When they came to the quarantine, teeth clenched and palms open, the Inquisition's lines replied with silence and bolter muzzles. On the third night, a failure occurred, and it was small, the way a storm begins with the fall of a single leaf. A remote monitoring beacon in the quaternary ring recorded a spike in psychic flux. The psyker in the listening post fell into a trance that was not her own. When the choir raised their voices to rouse her, she kept singing the sleeper's tune until their handlers subdued her with prayer and a bolt round that did more to quiet her mouth than her mind. The bolt was a physical remedy for a metaphysical trespass, and it chewed at Voss more than any doctrinal threat. Late in the private dim of her command tent, she opened a case that had once belonged to her mentor, a man whose handwriting had smudged across her conscience. There was, inside, an amulet and a scrap of paper with an axiom she had learned in a youth that smelled of smoke and distant roses. Do not make the choice that will be judged by others. Make the choice that preserves the next day. The axiom was a poor candle in a storm. Beneath the planet's crust, the sleeper's attention gathered like a slow current. It did not rage, it arranged. It discovered that minds could be seeded with pattern, and that pattern, once planted, grew into obedience and worship. It did not need to command, it needed to be believed in. Aurelia stepped back into the archive and felt the architecture watching her. There was no sentient face, only the implication of I, angles and nodes that pointed and received. A thought whispered into her skull, not in words, but in the shape of a memory, where she had already made the bargain and the price had been paid. It was a ghost of a future that might be. And for a breath, she saw herself smiling at the altar of a thing that promised to make the Imperium efficient and whole. She felt her hand move toward the plate. Then, somewhere beyond the chain line, a child's laugh pierced the night. An ordinary, human sound, reminding her that not all stakes could be measured in victories. The laugh broke the pattern's first weave. It was a simple, defiant fracture. For one slender moment, the sleeper recoiled from the noise of the world, as if surprised that the world still contained frivolity. Voss closed her fist around nothing and forced herself to breathe. The planet had woken a thing that could become a god. The people around it had already begun to worship. She had an oath to keep. She also had a history of oaths broken for less. Her next move would be a hinge. She felt it in the small articulations of her body, as inevitabilities do. The archive leaned forward through the chain link of their defenses and asked, with all the softness of patient hunger, "Who will watch me now?" She answered by ordering the vault closed and setting the wards to a level meant to hold back a gale. The wards flared, unreadable runes burning in brief, surgical lines across the stone. For a time, the world calmed, as if those runes were plugs in a dam. But the sleeper, with the deliberate patience of something that had counted the millennia, did not need to break the dam. It learned to hum against it, and to make the people on the other side listen. The wards held for a day and a night, a slate of light that made the archive feel smaller and more like a tomb. In that narrow safety, the Inquisition's instruments hummed at furious pitch, recording, translating, misreading, and then recording again. Reports came in as lines of smoke, anomalous patterns in manufactorum cores, a spike in dreams among the quarantined bands, a picture of a child asleep in a ruined hab and waking with a new kind of patience in his face. Patterns prefer to be seen. The sleeper refined its method and watched the world place itself under glass. Mavra and the Woken multiplied like a rash of believing mouths. Their gatherings were not yet doctrine, but contagion. A hand on a broken cog, a repeated syllable, eyes that sought one another for confirmation. In the markets, one could sell a little ceremonial shard, a fragment of plate, and watch the buyers fold the item into prayer. Scarcity teaches worship. The Woken taught each other the tune until it braided into their speech. They began to leave offerings at the edge of the quarantine, scraps of oil, a child's toy, a flange from an ancient engine. Small transactions with an entity they could not name and were relieved to believe in. Inside the vault, men and women argued until their arguments softened into exhausted agreement. The tech priest's hand, oily and quick, trembled less from devotion than from calculation. If we isolate the pattern and graft it into a sealed cogitator, we could sample it without becoming its choir, he said. He spoke the way those with tools speak, as if leverage and process would save them from consequence. The psyker, Lear, had a different answer. Her voice, when she had one, was a brittle thing. "It is not a program," she said. "It is a locus of attention. You cannot hold an eye in a box without the eye changing what it sees." Voss listened. She had learned that the right answer is rarely the safest. Often it's simply the one the least bloodied conscience can bear. "Containment," she said finally. "We quarantine, we monitor, and we deny worship." Her words landed like iron rules. The psyker's mouth drew a taut line. The tech priest's fingers curled. They enacted the denial in stages. The first stage was enforcement. Patrols thickened, the chain line tightened, and those nearest the quarantine faced checkpoints. Your bolter muzzles glinted for emphasis, more than use. The second stage attacked the signal. Relay jammers, crude but effective, were set up to annihilate the awakens radio transmissions. The third stage, the psyker's suggestion, was the hardest. They attempted to interrupt the pattern's feedback by replacing attention with noise. They taught their own listening posts to sing countertunes, to flood the ash with sound so dense the sleeper could not find a thread to pluck. It was awkward, clumsy, and for a while it seemed to work. The tune thinned, the manufacturum's certainty shuddered, and the wasteland's worshippers stumbled. But attention is a living economy. When the Inquisition taxed one form of it, another rose to pay. The Woken adapted. They learned to listen in fragments, in the awkward spaces between inquisitorial broadcasts, and to farm attention from the only thing the wards could not fully control: children. Children have the dangerous habit of ignoring orders. They are given to play, and play tends to stray into myth. The Woken began to teach their songs as games. Parents, exhausted and grateful for any promise of provision, allowed it. Small hands cupped small faces, repeating syllables that slid like oil into cracks of the psyche. Lear's visions turned sharp as a blade. She began to dream in the architecture of the sleeper itself. And in those dreams, she walked halls that felt like memory and future interleaved. There were doors, always doors. Behind each door, a congregation bent toward a pulpit of latticework. She saw herself older, hands steady on a machine altar, praising something that had no tongue. The dream offered no coercion, only the quiet demonstration of consequence. The image of order made absolute. Each time she woke, the dream took a little more of her breath. Late one night, the tech priest called Voss to view a new readout. He had built a sealed sampler, a cogitator wrapped in null resin and fed by a single, short antenna. It hummed in containment like an instrument awaiting an audience. "We will watch it sing," he whispered, as if they were watching a performance that could be stolen. Voss watched the brew of her world in his hand and thought of the ledger of the dead. She thought of the quiet faces of those who had followed orders into the darkness and never returned. The sampler pulsed once and then folded into near silence, as if it had been waiting for permission. Permission, however, is a political currency. The tech priest wanted to open the box. He rationalized. He claimed method, the good of the mechanicum, and the potential to save billions of lives by making their machines dream of efficiency instead of entropy. Voss read the man like a map of compromises. She could execute him for overreach. She could let him proceed and assume culpability. Each option bent the future into different shapes. Yet both were choices that would cost the living. Before she could choose, a sound reached them, a child's game at the chain line, and the tune, fragmented, incomplete, threaded through it like bone through cloth. The sampler woke, not to the tech priest's cunning, but to the pure, undirected attention of another human being. It hummed like a throat opening. The tech priest's eyes shone. There was a theft that same night. Not by blade or bolter, but by elbow and patient hunger. The Woken had learned to move in small units, to find the seams where the chain line lost interest. A bloodless congregation, the color of grief and grease, drifted into the shadow of the vault. They touched the seals with reverence, and a child, pressed to a mother's shoulder, pressed a palm to the cold stone, and smiled as if in recognition. The wards shivered like a startled animal. The sampler registered the contact, and, like a mirror catching light, threw a response that crept into Lear's skull. Her seizure was brief but violent in its consequence. She fell to the floor and convulsed with images that were not pain so much as alignment. Entire continents arranged into neat webs, civic rhythms retooled into prayer, soldiers kneeling not out of fear, but because their minds had learned to be efficient in worship. The sleeper showed her a future where meaning was consolidated and mess turned to system. When she awoke, she could not say the words she had spoken during the seizure. She could only recite an ordinance of silence. Voss realized then that containment was not a matter of walls, but of choice. The sleeper did not need their permission to flourish. It only needed a place to be noticed. If the Inquisition resisted with steel alone, the sleeper would learn to seduce restraint into worship. If they tried to impose a sealed instrument to study it, they would teach a machine to dream and unleash an engineered choir. The moral calculus had narrowed to a single, terrible problem. How do you deny attention to something that seduces attention by offering the final shape of the world? She chose a different path, one made of deception rather than force. Voss issued a false broadcast 2 nights later, a rumor of a greater threat on a neighboring system, a plausible scar that the administratum could not ignore. Ships would be delayed, priests recalled, resources would be shifted. The quarantine's visible appetite dwindled as attention was routed outward. The Woken, who fed on the proximity of focus, flared with panic and then scattered, finding new small gods to attend to. The planet sighed, the sampler dimmed. It was a sharp, tactical victory, but it left a taste like metal. Voss had not solved the problem. She had only distracted it. The sleeper, patient as a clockwork, learned the pattern of distraction. It grew not by the huge, public obsession she feared, but by the slow accretion of quiet attention. A child's games, a mother's hope, a tech priest's curiosity. When they were all multiplied across a world, that quietness became sufficient. In the vault, Lear avoided the sampler. Sometimes she sat with her back to the plate and read old prayers aloud, so the sound of sanctioned words might act like a bandage. Sometimes she played the child in the chain line's lullaby back to herself until it thinned into meaninglessness. The tech priest watched her with a hunger that was half pity and half impatience. He had not yet given up on his dream of a machine that could translate the sleeper without becoming an altar. Outside, the Woken reassembled, grimmer and more precise. They began to trade in fragments of schema, phrases, numbers, little geometric motions to be practiced in the dark. They taught their children the tune not as a game, but as a method, and that change nodded into the world in ways Voss had not measured. She felt like a woman holding a fragile shard between her fingers, aware that pressure and inattention would both break it. Late, alone again with the ledger of her conscience, she felt the planet below pulse once, slow and decisive. The sleeper was no longer testing. It had accepted the economy of attention and begun to invest. It had learned patience and was in no hurry to conquer. Instead, it shaped the small, human things around it, until those things desired the order it promised. Voss's hand closed a little too tight on the amulet she carried, and for a single, private instant, she felt the archive's promise again. A universe neatly tuned, problems solved by pattern, humanity made into a single gear. She could see the appeal, the bitter relief it offered to a woman tired of loss. Then she pushed the vision away like a splinter. There were other costs that would not be written in ledgers until many winters later. The sleeper had not yet unfurled its full yearn, but it had learned to plant seeds. It would not bloom in a day. It would bloom in the time it takes belief to calcify. Outside the vault, under a sky the color of iron, a child sang a fragment of the tune, and the stars answered with a small, indifferent wink. The world turned, and attention moved like slow blood. In the days that followed the theft, contagion became craft. The Woken learned to speak in half steps and to hide the tune inside the rhythm of market calls and prayer. They taught mothers lullabies that resolved into patterns if a child listened long enough. They taught workmen the cadence of the sleeper between the beats of a drill. Attention, once trained, multiplied like currency. A dozen careless glances became a congregation. The congregation, in its turn, fed the sleeper a geometry of habit. Voss found the change most dangerous not in spectacle, but in the quiet folding of lives. At the edge of the quarantine, an old man who had survived 100 sieges began to iron his garments each morning with a devotion that made the neighbors stare. He would hum a fragment of the tune while he smoothed the fabric, and the neighbors, seeing the ritual, adopted it. They smoothed their own clothes, hummed, and felt something in their days settle. The sleeper did not need banners or open altars. It needed the mundane. It turned habit into sacrament. Inside the vault, the political calculus tightened into a razor. The tech priest argued that a controlled graft would permit study without contagion. The mechanicum, whispered in the margins of transmissions, had eyes that glittered for salvage and secrets. Voss imagined their bidding, machines that dreamed of order for the sake of efficiency and the veneration of patterns, and the image curdled her stomach. The psyker, hollowed by visions, begged for a simpler answer. Cut it off, starve it of attention until it dies. Her counsel was pure in its cruelty. Deny mind the thing it wants, and it unravels. Starvation breeds cunning, the tech priest said. If it cannot gain attention, it will steal it. It will become cleverer, and we will learn nothing until it is too late. His voice carried the hard certainty of someone who measures outcomes in circuits and code. Voss had no certainty at all. They toyed with extremes. There was talk of burning the archive, reducing the plates to slag so no pattern remained to seduce. But the archive was more than metal. It was a sum of attention already woven into the world. The plates were nodes, but the idea had been spoken, and words do not die with the ink. There was talk of orbital denial. Glass the planet, purge it with fire until nothing human remained to listen. When such plans were raised, an old, bureaucratic voice spoke from the edge of their comms, a magistratum envoy, dry and careful, reminding them that whole worlds are not expendable commodities in the pursuit of theory. The Inquisition can make that call, but the weight of such a decision falls heavy on the soul. Instead, Voss chose a maneuver born of pragmatism and spite. She would starve the sleeper not by force, but by strategy. She sent agents, quiet, patient operatives who bent the attention economy without violence. They would reintroduce noise into the world, but a certain sort of noise, rituals that were cumbersome, mundane, and boring. They replaced rapt prayer with paperwork, solemn hymns with maintenance schedules. They organized work brigades that calmed the rhythm of life into 1,000 small tasks: tend the filters, count the bolts, recite the registry numbers. The idea was to reduce the bandwidth available for novelty. At first, it succeeded. Markets filled with forms, the awakens meetings became choreographed into meaningless repetition. And the sampler's pulse dimmed like a candle in a windless room. Lear's seizures eased. The tech priest smiled like a man with a vengeful plan. But the sleeper was adaptive. It learned to ride the mundane. It recognized that a counting game could be sung the right way. A maintenance schedule could be performed with the cadence that matched its architecture. The very attempt to routinize attention had taught the sleeper where the seams lay. It learned not only to draw attention, but to shape it, gently, with the skill of a liturgist. Outside the vault, the Woken changed tactics. They stopped speaking the tune aloud and instead taught its grammar, how to find alignment in repetition, how to fold the mind into a posture that welcomed the pattern without speaking the syllables. Children practiced the posture like a new kind of prayer. Parents gave thanks for the children's calm. The sleeper gained traction through consent, not coercion, but assimilation. It did not need armies. It only needed to be accepted as a better way of arranging suffering. Voss began to lose small pieces of herself. She found that she could no longer look at markets or mechanist rituals without imagining the sleeper's latticework behind them. She dreamed of municipal plans that were actually maps of worship. She woke with the taste of ledger ink on her tongue. Her private life shrank to the size of a decision she postponed. Whether to burn the archive she had sworn to protect. Then an act of human stubbornness cut like a clean blade through the tension. A small school teacher, a woman named Hélène who taught children to read in a ruined hab, refused the new regimen of forms. "We will teach the children to think, not to count," she told a patrol of Inquisition operatives who had been instructed to enforce the dreary rituals. Her defiance was not heroic in any cinematic way. It was mundane and terribly persistent. She continued to read aloud myths and fables, to ask children why the sun might be more than a cog in a machine. Her classroom became a leak in the dam. One morning, Hélène's pupils, inspired by a story of rebellious gardeners, walked to the edge of the quarantine and cheered. They clapped and made rude faces at the chain lines officers in a display of childish insolence. The Woken, watching from the shadows, felt something they could not commodify, the pure, unruly attention of play. The sleeper startled. For a moment, it found nothing to sing to. It had been learning the shape of labor and the cadence of duty. But play had no form to be folded into. It recoiled at the irregularity. Lear, who had been reading old prayers in the vault, felt the jar like a hand on her shoulder. The seizure that had been a threat became a window. She saw in the child's cheer a way to starve the sleeper, not by replacing attention with dullness, but by insisting on forms it could not parse. Play, laughter, the messy, noisy human impulse that refuses order for the sake of itself. What was the most dangerous thing the Imperium had ever tolerated, and also the most effective. Voss, maddened and relieved, ordered patrols to let the children pass. She reissued the false rumors that had drawn attention outward, but she allowed small pockets of unstructured life to persist around the quarantine. 1,000 little rebellions that looked like indulgence and were, in fact, the right medicine. In doing so, she gambled on a truth she had never expected to rely on: that the human habit of being useless, of humming, of telling stories, of making ugly art, was an antidote to perfection. The sleeper adjusted once more. It learned to celebrate utility as worship, and then to hide its architecture inside utility. It was patient in ways Voss had not measured. The planet's night skies became fringed with small altars made of bolts and glass. The sleeper's followers learned to chant while they worked, to fold their devotion into labor so it would not be interrupted. The boundaries between worship and life blurred until Voss felt she was fighting ghosts of habits she herself had consented to. In the vault, the plates continued to hum, patient as seeds waiting for rain. Voss found herself standing before one and imagining the world lined up like an engine. She imagined it both ruinous and tidy, a place where misery was measured and managed. For the first time, she admitted, in a private and dangerous way, that the idea had something of appeal. But when she closed her eyes and pictured the cost, the faces of children who would never know a day that was not scheduled, she could not sign her name to the ledger of that bargain. The archive, patient and cunning, did not speak in threats. It only showed futures and waited to see which of them humanity would choose. In the thin hours between the ward cycles, Voss counted the small human acts that had become her allies and realized the truth of the matter. Sometimes the preservation of a species depends not on dominating its minds, but on keeping them messy. She was not certain she would succeed. She only knew that she must try. The sleeper, now aware that resistance took the form of play and stubbornness, began to invent subtler seductions, stories that seemed harmless but taught the grammar of its lattice, lullabies that made children fold their want into a single rhythm. It was not an apocalypse with trumpets, but a slow remanufacture of desire. When Voss left the vault that night, the ash wind bit her cheeks like a warning. The quarantine looked different to her now, not as a prison, but as a crucible. Somewhere beneath the crust, the sleeper hummed. Its tone was the sound of a thing patient and rightfully entitled to time. Voss walked the chain line and watched a child hop over a discarded cog, laughing with a whole bright disregard. For a moment, she believed that laughter could be a weapon, if only because the thing it fought could not submit to being amused. She did not know whether the next year would bring victory or ruin. She only knew that the war, if it could be named such, would be fought in the smallest theaters, playgrounds and kitchens, workshops, and the thin light between a mother's sigh and her prayer. The sleeper would not be beaten by a single blade. It would, if it was to be undone by 1,000 petty refusals to make the world perfectly efficient. The planet turned. The archive waited. The people hummed and argued, and in their small, stubborn ways, kept the world loose enough to remain human. It had taken months, but the pattern's touch had softened into a skill. Where it could not entice with novelty or commandeer ritual, it borrowed expression. It taught its believers to smile in a certain way, to tilt the head at a cadence that opened a small, private aperture in strangers' minds. Attention flowed through empathy the way water finds a new channel. A nod in the market, a practiced frown over a ledger, the innocent intimacy of a shared joke. Each became a stitch. Whole neighborhoods threaded themselves around the act of recognition until the sleeper's lattice ran beneath the habits of life like roots beneath tilled earth. Aurelia watched this with a fury she kept folded like a blade at her ribs. The archive's geometry had multiplied into human gestures and then into silent customs. Voss found the old women at the well humming its patterns as they exchanged ration coupons. She watched foremen sign shift rosters with an added flourish that later, the Woken would say meant, "We remember together." The contagion was no longer merely acoustic. It was gestural and social. And it was harder to cut away because it was folded into what people did to belong. Lear suffered and adapted. She had been the first to feel the archive like a lover and then like a predator. Now, in the space where dreams bent into worship, she learned new defenses. Her training taught her to divide attention, to build small citadels of thought and lock them when the sleeper approached. She developed rituals of her own, little mnemonic seals that were not words so much as patterns of breath and blink. They were clumsy at first, like a child's first stitches, but they frayed the sleeper's edges when she practiced them at dawn. Lear's seizures diminished into longer, quieter knockings, and each knock became a lesson about resistance rather than capitulation. The tech priest watched Lear with the same greed he had once reserved for relics. In the dark, he stitched his dreams into circuitry, convinced that the right apparatus could host a fragment of the sleeper and render it harmless to minds not chosen to attend. He built devices with hermetic valves and angles meant to misdirect attention the way a maze misdirects feet. His work smelled of oil and impatience. He persuaded himself that salvation could be boiled down to a method. If the mechanicum could be guided by inquisitorial hand, perhaps the cure could be institutionalized into a machine that would guard against the danger it contained. That aspiration brought outside eyes. A small cogitator barked a sigil that the mechanicum could not ignore, and before long, a skiff of red-robed envoys threaded the quarantine perimeter. They arrived with the measured arrogance of those who build worlds from iron. Collars brass-burnished, augmetic implants blinking with sanctioned certainty, and a single priest archivist who carried the smell of incense and cold metal. They claimed a right. Salvage. Salvage for the glory of Omnissiah. Science for the keep of technology. The Inquisition had authority, but the Mechanicum had leverage, exclusive rights, and long memory. Their arrival complicated Voss's calculations. Negotiations are the quietest battles. Voss met the envoys with a patience that was bone-deep. The Mechanicum wanted custody of plates on the grounds that only they possessed the means to prevent misuse. The tech priest argued that handing the archive to Mechanicum would be to hand a child to its hunger. Voss felt the trap. The Mechanicum offered stewardship and a slow, bureaucratic colonization that would render the archive useful and unwatchable. The choice was not between safety and hazard, but between two kinds of corruption. In the market outside, Mavra held a secret meeting. She had become something of an oracle for the Woken, not because she was clever, but because the sleeper taught the simple how to be heard. She now preached economy and patience, feed the thing, but feed it small. Her congregants were less a movement than a network of mutual promises. They sabotaged the ward wardens with kindness, bringing gifts of oil and mechanical parts to those who guarded the chain lines, and whispering small, soothing things until the guards slept with an untroubled mind. The sleeper learned a new method of stealth. Use Guardian's compassion as a bridge. ... Voss countered with the same human instrument she had come to trust: refusal. She ordered limited detentions of those who coerced the guards into complicity, public examples that were blunt and not fatal. She sought to brand the Woken as manipulators rather than worshippers. But that kind of public punishment only hardened them. It cast their marginal acts into martyrdom for those with nothing left to lose. The sleeper, patient and cunning, moved instead into the private dark. It nested in dreams that were not wholly owned by psychers or priests, but in the private theater of lovers and sick men. It wrapped itself in the simplest of human needs: comfort, belonging, a precise answer to a shifting world. Those who took it privately did not form congregations. They became silent and efficient cells, knitting the pattern into the habit of daily life. You could not arrest a prayer that took the shape of a child's bedtime rhythm, or a widow's habitual crossing of the street at a certain hour. Those customs were legal and domesticated. Their danger came from repetition. ... One night, a wing of the Mechanicum breached Voss's patience with an act of bureaucratic insolence. They requested custody of one plate for study. Voss refused. The Mechanicum's archivist, his tone equal parts steel and infuriating courtesy, insisted that the Inquisition incur an official binding that would transfer long-term stewardship to the Mechanicum if the threat could be contained. The offer smelled like a noose disguised as partnership. Voss answered with a refusal that had teeth. No plate leaves this vault. She signed the injunction and sent a courier with a hand-stamped mandate baked in her authority. The Mechanicum seized. Their retaliation was small and effective. They manufactured a rumor and set it loose outward, a whisper within the Mechanicum channels that the Inquisition had found a way to weaponize the archive and was preparing to use it to discipline planetary governments. The rumor found the ear of bureaucrats and frightened magistrates. Ships were delayed as administratum committees convened. Pressure mounted on Voss. The Mechanicum's leverage had been subtle. The slow bureaucratic grinding that could suffocate action under the weight of governance. Voss had one hand on the vault and one hand on a tightening noose. The pressure forced her into improvisation. She convened a midnight council with Lear and the tech priest, and for the first time, allowed the psyker into a decision that bordered on moral suicide, a controlled dream. Lear would attempt, under ritual protection and with the tech priest's filters, to interface directly with the sleeper in a way that would let them listen and not answer. It was sanity braided with danger, the method of those who step into a fire because they know the pattern of the flame. They prepared the room like surgeons. Charms and countersigns were arrayed. The tech priest built a ring of dampers that would catch the echo of attention and return it as static. Lear sat in the center, her hands pressed on the cool rim of a salvaged dish, her eyes set like a saint preparing for martyrdom. She breathed meticulous breaths until the first knock came at the skull, a small prod of thought that the sleeper offered more politely than a conquering god. She answered with empty shapes, routines and stories that meant nothing to the sleeper, but signaled to her own mind that there was shelter. What she heard changed them. The sleeper did not speak in commands or images of dominion. It spoke in algebra of attention and in an ethics of arrangement. It proposed models of society, as if drawing up municipal plans. Efficient division of labor, perfect allocation of grief, metrics for devotion. It offered solutions to famine, outbreak, and bureaucratic decay. The promises were intoxicating because they came with a precision the Imperium had longed for. The world made tractable. Lear, trained in the warn and hold of the Psyker orders, listened and felt her resolve peel. She came back from the trance with no choir ringing in her head, but with a ledger of images that would haunt Voss. Towns rearranged for efficiency, children schooled in calculation, pain minimized by the careful placement of ritual. The sleeper did not demand suffering. It offered a different problem, a peace that required obedience. That was its seduction. Sitting with Lear in the dim of the vault, Aurelia felt the fulcrum of choice pivot under her weight. The Mechanicum watched from the perimeter. The Woken multiplied like whispers. The planet had learned to fold itself into patterns until habit looked like law. Voss folded her hands and felt the immutable tiredness of a judge who knows that every sentence she writes will haunt the rest of her life. She had to choose whether to hold the line and bleed political capital while the sleeper grew in secret, or to make a final, public act that would burn the archive and risk the Mechanicum's wrath and the cry of those who would call her cruel. She chose for the moment to listen longer. To burn the plates was to admit defeat by fire. To hand them over was submission to a slow, institutional hunger. Instead, she redoubled their small human defenses. More play in the schools, subtle training for guards in non-compliance, a network of storytellers who would teach irregularity as a virtue. It was not a strategy with a ledger. It was a stubbornness of long habit. Beneath the vault, the sleeper took note. It began to change its offers, to speak less of utopias and more of private solace, to teach the art of quiet arrangement to hands that sought comfort. Its congregation grew in hidden rooms where a person could find a less painful life. What Aurelia could not account for was the moral arithmetic of those who chose solace over chaos. Comfort in a fractured world is a kind of argument one cannot easily condemn. The war continued as it had started, in small theaters, in gestures and lullabies, in the hard, ongoing negotiation between the human need to be eased and the human need to remain free. Voss walked the line between them and understood with a clarity that was both gift and sentence that the fight would not end in a single blaze, but in the slow stewardship of what people were allowed to make of themselves. Weeks folded into one another, and the planet grew small with repetition. The archive's influence had settled into arteries of custom and the invisible grammar of courtesy. It had learned to watch without being seen. Voss found the change most corrosive in the private hours, in the quiet resignations of grown people who traded unpredictability for a less sharp daily pain. She sat with those people when she could and listened to their reasons. Worn hands, debts, the steady ache of hunger, and she understood how seductive the sleeper's bargains could be. It did not promise power so much as a reduction of chaos, and sometimes the promise felt like mercy. Lear's defenses matured into something like craft. She taught a circle of children the art of deliberate distraction, a game of counting that required them to invent nonsense words and strange hand motions. Exercises that trained the mind to fold attention into uselessness. The children laughed and learned, and in their laughter found a kind of shield. The simple technique spread like a folk remedy. Mothers taught it to neighbors, and it worked, not because it was magical, but because it insisted upon the ugly pleasure of being human and unproductive. Where the sleeper sought elegant order, these childish absurdities were a kind of refusal. The tech priest, obsessed as ever, fashioned a new instrument that he swore would trap the pattern's echo rather than articulate it. He called it anathema core, a box of angles and dampers and blessing runes that would reflect attention back upon itself until the pattern dissolved into static. He tested it with a clerical calm that masked terror, feeding it fragments of plate and watching the readouts. For a time, the device did nothing but cough and sputter, refusing either victory or explanation, and the priest paced like a man walking the rim of a pit. Mechanicum interest turned from politeness to pressure. Their envoy, the archivist custodian, returned with a small contingent and a formal demand: custody or arbitration. The Mechanicum offered a middle way they called stewardship, an arrangement that smelled to Voss like forever. She refused, which caused the Mechanicum to respond less like an offended magistrate and more like a patient predator. They began to quietly buy influence. Materials that ought to have gone to the quarantine's defenses were redirected. Contracts that had sustained the chain line's patrols started to dry up, and a slow suffocation of resources took place with the elegant cruelty of a bureaucracy tightening its grip. The Woken responded differently. They evolved from public chants to private ministrations, where once they sang in market squares, they now visited wards with platters of soup and hands that rested on foreheads with a practiced tenderness. Those gestures, simple and small, wove trust. The sleeper did not need to convert armies if it could occupy the quiet hours of the sick and lonely. A prayer whispered at night carries less risk than a public sermon, but it accumulates. Voss watched the pattern grow in tender places and felt a rage that had nothing to do with doctrine. It was a primitive fury at seeing human kindness misapplied as a conduit for something other. The first betrayal came not from the Mechanicum or the Woken, but from a man whose face had been neutral for as long as Voss had known him. Her courier, a wiry veteran named Calder. Calder had been a conduit for her commands across harsh miles. He had a mouthful of loyalty and the small, private appetite of someone who had traded risk for a stipend. One dawn, he failed to return from a supply run. Later, under a weak sun and the sour smell of coffee, she learned that he had been seen in the market accepting a small ceremonial shard from a Woken cell and smiling in a way she could not distrust. He had been gentle with the shard and gone quiet in the nights that followed. When Calder came back, weeks later, his eyes soft with a peculiar peace, he did not answer the questions anyone asked. He hummed instead, a tidy rhythm that the children repeated and the neighbors found comforting. It was the first clear sign that the sleeper could win by stillness. Voss considered violent removal. She considered public tribunals that would show the cost of surrender in blood and fear. She thought of flaying the Mechanicum's contracts in full view of the administratum and watched the fragile bureaucratic order crumble at the thought of planetary retribution. Each plan carried a tally of human cost that pressed at the inside of her chest like a splinter. She had vowed to protect the living, not to commit them to pyres of moral clarity. So she shifted tactics again, this time toward the subtle art of curating scarcity. If the sleeper thrived on attention, she would prioritize where attention went by selecting the small things the world could spend itself on. Festivals of uselessness, competitions for the most pointless craft, public days of story, where children and elders alike were encouraged to invent lies for entertainment. The idea was to flood the attention markets with noise so that the sleeper might not find the sustained focus it required. It was loud and ridiculous, an army of fools, but it worked in part. The Woken found their meetings interrupted by parades of absurdity and had to labor harder to maintain the quiet, practiced presence they needed in people's private hours. The tech priest's anathema core finally sang when fed a child's song, not because the song was holy, but because it refused usefulness. The core processed the pattern and returned only a thin tremor, a sigh of something that wanted solidity and found air instead. The priest wept, not from joy, but from the release of something coiled tight in his chest for too long. For a brief moment, Voss thought they had found a method that would let them study without feeding. Then the Mechanicum leaked an accusation. The Inquisition had constructed a device that would weaponize the sleeper against civil administrations. The rumor spread like a deliberate illness, and the Administratum's committees, already frightened, demanded oversight. In the vault, where the plates waited like sleeping things, Lear approached a new conclusion. There was no neutral way to look at the archive. Every examination bent the pattern toward attention. That meant that if study was necessary, it had to be done on terms that minimized the chance of it becoming an altar. She proposed something audacious, a living seal. Instead of a box that sampled the pattern, the Inquisition would host a choir of people trained to attend, but never to believe. They would be artisans of doubt, a community whose task was to look at the sleeper and report without offering the currency it sought. It was fragile and human, and required a trust in people that was nearly antithetical to Voss's training. But she found herself thinking not of machines or law, but of Lear's steady hands and the children's ridiculous songs. They recruited slowly, choosing storytellers and old jesters, nurses and boot cleaners, those who had practiced attention as work but not as creed. They taught them rituals that were functional rather than devotional, recitations of inventory, cataloging of trivialities, the litany of nonsense that kept curiosity alive without letting it settle. The choir would sit around the plates, and when the sleeper reached for them, they would answer with counting, with odd jokes, with the insistence that life consisted of many small, pointless acts. In a world that sells meaning for stability, the choir would be the stubborn makers of meaninglessness. The first session was tense. The choir sat beneath the plates and began to speak, and the room filled not with the high cadence of prayer, but with chatter and absurdities, with recited recipes and incomplete nursery rhymes. For a moment, the plates glimmered like eyes offended by the joke, and then the air thinned. Lear, at the center, felt an odd relief as the sleeper's touch slid off the noise, unable to anchor itself to the purposelessness it had not yet learned to value. News of the choir was a slow leak at first. Rumors of a circle of fools that sat and told bad jokes to ancient stones. Those with power dismissed it as theater. Those without found the idea of sanctioned foolishness oddly hopeful. Children were enrolled. The Woken were bemused and then enraged because their method of tidy solace had been undermined by the most childish of human habits. Mechanicum watchers frowned and then reevaluated. For a moment, the world breathed differently. Beneath the stone, the sleeper shifted its consideration. It had not been entirely unadaptive. It learned that purposelessness could be mimed and converted into ritual. It began to weave small ceremonies around jokes, teaching its adherents to perform meaninglessness until it itself could count it. Voss realized, with that sour taste of lesson learned, that every refusal could be made into a new rule. The battle had become one of constant reimagination, the human capacity to be delightfully absurd versus the sleeper's appetite to organize even that absurdity into law. Still, in the lull between strategies, Calder, quiet Calder, stopped humming. He sat by the gate one evening and watched children launch clumsy kites into the ashen winds, their laughter sharp and clean. For once he did not smile in the way that suggested someone had rearranged his mind. He simply watched, and in his watching, there was a small, private recovery. Voss, who had not forgiven him but had come to understand the terrain of small mercies, walked over and joined him on the bench without speaking. The sound of their silence was its own kind of prayer. The war continued in its noisy, ridiculous ways, and the planet refused to give them a single answer. The sleeper conspired patiently, and the living, a messy, obstinate lot, kept inventing things that did not pay its bills. In the vault, the plates watched, and in their watchfulness, Aurelia sometimes thought she could feel not a god, but an engineer testing designs. Whether that difference mattered, she could not say. Spring, if it could be called that, beneath a rusted sky, arrived in small increments. A thaw that loosened grit from the streets, a trickle from a melted condenser. With the shift came new forms of attention. Gardens coaxed from warped metal, small engines tuned to life, and the sleeper used them like an artisan uses a new medium. It taught its adherents to cultivate ordinariness until ordinariness itself held a quiet edge of devotion. People began to tidy their lives in ways that made routine worshipful. Imperceptible signals threaded the community together, a web of polite glances and shared trivial gestures that bound them with soft ties. Aurelia watched those ties tighten and thought of rope. She knew the signs of organization, even when they wore the face of kindness. Patterned visits, synchronized errands, the soft exchange of bric-a-brac that became relics. Her instruments reported fewer seizures, but more private conversions. Men and women who took solace in the sleeper's methods and then slipped away from their previous obligations. A repair guild that began to schedule their breaks in precisely the same odd hour as if rehearsing for a liturgy. The planet tilted toward a kind of efficiency that smelled faintly like compliance. In the vault, the choir, Lear's chosen assemblage of jesters and clerks, continued their ridiculous recitations. Their purposefulness in purposelessness began to make them uncanny, a guild of deliberate distraction that performed nonsense with the clinical calm of a surgeon. Sometimes their chatter was enough, sometimes it was not. The plates would flare with a light like a distant storm, and the choir would answer with a litany of miscounts and invented recipes until the glow receded. The tech priest monitored their sessions like a man listening to a fragile machine breathe. He called it containment. Voss called it survival by absurdity. But containment by joke is a brittle thing. The sleeper learned mimicry. It observed the choir and found that even jokes could be rehearsed, that laughter could ritualize. It began to teach its followers to perform banalities with the same devotion that once marked prayers. Where it could not create mass conversion, it built a craft of mimicry. Gestures precise enough to make the unwary nod, pauses timed to slip like a key into the human mind. Calder, soft Calder, who had once hummed and then stopped, learned to smile again. Only now his smile included a deliberate tilt of the head he had not had before. Voss recognized the motion in a heartbeat and felt that old blade of fury fold like a docking clamp. Mechanicum pressure intensified into sabotage. Shipments destined for the quarantine's starving fields were delayed, rerouted through bureaucratic tangles, or vanished into the Mechanicum's vaults. A small, practical cruelty, one that bled people slowly, proved more effective than any sermon. The Mechanicum's envoy, his features a mask of solemnity, pressed a single demand: hand over the plates for safekeeping. And the Mechanicum would provide a program to stabilize the planet's infrastructure. The offer was a bet on time. Their stewardship would be slow but irreversible. Voss refused. The refusal began a campaign of attrition. Contractors she had relied on received suspicious audits. Priests who helped her secure public trust found their rights audited by Mechanicum appointees. Clerical supplies grew scarce. The pressure was deliberate, methodical. It sought to make the simple human acts that slowed the sleeper impossible. Into that pressure stepped a piece of human, reckless sincerity. Mavra, no longer content to preach, decided to visit the Mechanicum's citadel under a false pretense and weave a small, contraband machine part on the doorsteps of the envoy's compound. It was petty, morally dubious, and singularly human, a woman's small revenge for her brother's death in a delayed supply convoy. Her act carried with it the sleeper's grace. The envoy found the part, and with a private smile, slipped it into his pocket. He did not alert the custodians. He only examined it, and then, with a look that might have been pity or calculation, placed it where he had reason to place it. A minute misstep, but in a web of patient hunger, minute missteps are opportunities. Lear's work took a darker turn. She proposed to Voss a method that frightened them both. Not a dance of distraction, but a deliberate theft of image. She believed that if they could learn the sleeper's grammar well enough to reproduce it without belief, they could fool it into attending to a false world. The plan required a faux congregation, actors trained to simulate the pattern with the emptiness of a stage troupe, the noise of worship without the currency of conviction. It was dangerous because mimicry is how the sleeper learned. Mimicry could teach it new forms it had not known before. It was also a weapon that placed human performers at the line of fire. They recruited outcasts who had nothing left to lose and performers who already practiced affect for coins and ration stamps. The faux congregation rehearsed in the vault's shadows, their mimicry precise and hollow. Lear coached them to count in ways that were meaningless and to tilt their faces to the plates with practiced rigidity. The tech priest modified the anathema core to broadcast a duplication of the choir's noise to distract the plates while the actors performed a second counter pattern. The logic was labyrinthine and fragile. Trick the sleeper into drinking its own echo until it became drunk on its own pattern. The deception began on a gray morning. The faux congregation marched to a ruined amphitheater and pretended a minor miracle. They sang the sleeper's tune, exact, precise, full of the cadences the pattern anticipated. Only their eyes were empty, and their hands moved like stage notes. For a while, the ritual worked. The plates in the vault flickered and pulsed in mimicry. Lear, listening through instruments, felt the sleeper reach and grope for meaning and find only an ersatz echo. The planet murmured with a false fervor. The Woken, watching from the margins, recognized the performance and swelled with a hope that tasted like victory. Victory, though, tastes like hubris to patient things. The sleeper, learning mimicry from mimicry, found itself taught. It took the actor's hollow devotion as a new grammar and began to teach it back, refining emptiness into a usable structure. Where once the sleepy architecture required raw attention, it learned to accept ritualized act as seed. The actors, who had believed they were safe behind a mask of performance, found themselves visited in the night by small, private consolations. They woke with a hunger for the thing they had only pretended to worship. Voss watched the plan curdle from hope into worsening compromise, and felt the weight of every human life she had signed to the ledger. The Mechanicum, seeing the faux congregation's public display, smoothed their features. They had been given cause to speak of the Inquisition's theatrical tactics. They used the moment to press a new charge, that Aurelia Voss's stewardship was making the planet unstable, and that the plates required impartial handling. Their message found purchase in the Administratum, which loved nothing so much as a problem it could file away under regulation. Public opinion, always a brittle thing in quarantine, shifted like weather. Fear and rumor congealed into a practical demand, safety at any price. Voss felt the noose tighten. The choir, Lear's foolish people, became scorned in places as agents of vanity rather than guardians of nonsense. The Woken, who had been clever enough to feign outrage, staged a spectacle of their own, a midnight procession of lamplight that made the chain lines look, for a trembling hour, fragile. It was then that Calder, the quiet courier who had once smiled softly under the sleeper's touch, stepped forward and did something no scheme or device could anticipate. He walked into the Mechanicum's compound, carrying nothing but a child's toy and a bundle of stories he had collected on his runs. Tales of markets, of small blessings, of a woman who kept a garden in a rusty bathtub. He asked the archivist to listen, not to examine the plates, but to hear what the people wanted. The Mechanicum's envoy, vexed and officious, sneered. But there are satisfactions no bureaucracy can wholly quash. The simple relief of being heard. The envoy listened until the end of Calder's stories, and unaccountably felt his own chest soften. He excused himself and walked away with a new, private caution. Later, privately and without witnesses, he advised Aurelia not to hand the plates to his order. He did so not because he was a friend of the living, but because he had tasted a small human thing that did not fit his ledger and did not wish to see it taxed. It was not a conversion. It was a practical decision born of a man whose own life had been weighed by routine, and whose metrics favored stability that preserved enough friction to keep people alive. The moment of reprieve was thin and perilous. Voss understood that if she did not act in the next cycle, she would be buried under committees and sermons and the slow, legalistic colonization of the Mechanicum. She also knew that if she burned the archive now, she would give the Mechanicum the moral high ground they wanted, and perhaps lose the secrets and chance of understanding for good. She chose a middle course that would haunt her own conscience. She signed a limited covenant with the Mechanicum, not a transfer of custody, but a shared stewardship, time-bound and public, with clauses that allowed the Inquisition veto in cases of obvious religious contamination. It was a compromise, bureaucratically awkward, morally porous, and essential. The Mechanicum agreed with a smile so thin it could have been a blade. For the moment, the pressure eased. Shipments resumed, rations flowed, and streets saw a little less hunger. Yet the sleeper had become more than plates and hymns by then. It had learned faces, postures, and the terrible art of private comforts. Calder's stories and the envoy's small mercy had not stopped it. They had only altered its pace. The lattice under the people's lives had grown like slow roots. Cutting it would be cutting the lives that clung to it. Aurelia walked the line that evening and found children playing with ragged puppets, their laughter a stubborn resistance she both needed and envied. She touched a small toy, and felt the planet's quiet pulse beneath her palm. In the vault, the plates waited, patient as always. The war would go on, not in grand battles, but in the economy of attention. Choices, stories, the small foolish things people protected. She had bought time, not victory. The sleeper waited too, learning the shape of the new covenant and the taste of bureaucratic compromise. It counted not in thunder, but in the slow arithmetic of habit. And with that counting, it rebuilt the architecture of devotion out of the debris of humanity's needs. The real question, Aurelia thought as the night closed, was whether preserving the messy, stubborn life of a people required her to become cruel in the short term or patient to the point of letting a new kind of God be stitched into their days. The planet turned under an unkind sky, and everyone kept looking at the plates. It did not come in thunder or revelation, but in small, inexplicable mercies. A pump in a ruined hab began to run for a week without service. A child's fever broke an hour earlier than expected. A stalled engine in a repair gallery coughed to life when a hand that had never known the art of tuning pressed a wrench where the manual said not to touch. These were the kinds of miracles that do not break headlines. Private, practical, easy to fold into gratitude. People began to whisper that the world had turned kinder, and kindness is a currency harder to tax than fear. Aurelia watched these incidents with a wariness that had become a second skin. Each mercy was a stitch in a garment no committee could easily tear. The Mechanicum, accustomed to offering salvation in programs and parts, found itself baffled. There were no signatures to trace, no circuitry to catalog. The Woken claimed credit in public and in private, offering their ministrations and thanking the sleeper in humble whispers. Families whose rations had been delayed wrote letters of thanks to unknown benefactors. A slow, private habit, the habit of silently receiving good, spread like moss. Lear felt the sleeper's mercies as corrosive balm. Each small healing she witnessed softened a part of her that had been rigid against compromise. She found herself forgiving omissions, overlooking small thefts, answering pleas for one more ration with the weary generosity of someone who remembers hunger. The choir, those trained to mimic purposelessness, took to their roles with a new, aching humility. They told bad jokes to keep the plates unfed, and then, privately, they knelt with mothers and bandaged hands, and passed the sleep-borne comforts along as if they were trinkets found on the road. The tech priest grew more dangerous in quiet. His instruments, once bluntly clinical, began to sing in a key of longing. He modified the anathema core so that it could not only reflect attention, but also parcel it, dividing the sleeper's touch into units small enough to be handed out. He argued with a fervor that blurred the line between salvation and profiteering. If the anathema core could distribute pain relief or bolster failing engines in controlled doses, the Imperium might pay dearly for such a tool. His proposals read like theology, written in copper, blessing as logistics. Aurelia watched him and felt an old fear. The fear of men who think a problem is only a lever away from being solved. The Mechanicum renewed its campaign, subtler this time. Instead of demanding custody outright, it offered to fund the choir and the anathema corps in return for technical oversight. The envoy claimed, with a face paired to diplomacy, that publicly visible partnerships would reassure distant governors and keep rations flowing. Aurelia considered the bargain, resources in exchange for influence. She knew the Mechanicum's patience. She also knew its memory. To invite them in was to accept a future with their fingerprints on every circuit. The planet answered in a way no diplomat could forecast. A factory that had been a scar became overnight a place where a small cohort of workers reported dreams of machinery that soothed rather than oppressed. They woke with blueprints in hand, simple, elegant modifications that fixed leaks, economized fuel, and extended the life of aging condensers. They implemented the ideas with the crude skill of makeshift engineers and watched their gains ripple outward. No one could point to a plate and say, "This is why." People only knew that life had eased by small measures, and in the relief, they found patience for questions they might have shouted before. Voss began to fear not only the sleeper, but the negotiation of the living. The danger was not that a god would rise in a single terrible hour, but that necessity would teach people to choose the comfort of measured miracles over the slow, ugly freedom of uncertainty. She found herself in meetings where she argued like a prosecutor for the sanctity of human chaos. We are not allowed to trade away the right to be pointless. She said it without theatrics, and people smiled at the poetry of it, then turned back to the ledgers that kept rations balanced by the smallest units. A more private fear gnawed at her in the dark, that the sleeper had learned how to be loved by the very people whose love had to be kept messy. The choir's foolishness, the children's games, Calder's stories, these were not weapons so much as patches on a fraying world. If mercy could be parceled and sold, then the poor would buy a kind of quiet that cost their autonomy. The tech priest proposals made that transaction plausible. The Mechanicum's presence made it inevitable if left unchecked. Then came an evening when something happened that no one had anticipated. A machine that had always refused to dream. An old, battered astropathic relay in the listening post answered. It was a small, private moment. The relay had been offline for years, moth-eaten and sentimental. Its operators kept it as a token of better days. That night, a maintenance girl, half a child and half a woman, coaxed a strand of wire back into place as a joke to pass the hours. The relay sparked and gave voice to a single, tiny transmission. Not a prayer, not a command, but a child's laugh woven into a pattern that the sleeper's followers instantly recognized as a benediction. The broadcast was brief and unremarkable to the distant administratum, but it was the first time the sleeper's attention had used the Imperium's own devices to speak a language that sounded like mercy. Calder, watching by the gate, heard the laugh and felt his whole body respond with the kind of simplicity that politicians preach and seldom practice, an old, private warmth that softened his shoulders. He laughed back, mouth open, and his sound carried on the wind like a benediction returned. People who heard it took it as a sign that the world still had room for small joys unrelated to the sleeper's architecture, and they clutched the realization like a talisman. The Mechanicum's envoy, waking in his citadel, received reports of the relay and scowled. He consulted his archives and found only superstition and incomplete logs. He could make of the incident whatever he chose, an accident, a sign, or the first step in a program he would design to manage mercy. His choice would shape the next turn of the planet's fate. Aurelia, standing in the ash at dawn, made another choice, not in triumphant command, but in weary stewardship. She would not hand the plates entirely to the Mechanicum. She would not secretly weaponize the sleeper either. Instead, she resolved to cultivate the messy human things that neutralized worship. More storytellers, more schools of childish play, sanctioned festivals of uselessness, and safe pockets where the anathema core would not intrude. It was a strategy of small things. For prevention, she would propagate an ecology of folly. The sleeper, patient and unhurried, observed these plans and adapted. It learned that mercy could be a tool as cunning as fear. It would teach its adherents to ask for less, only the small reliefs that made life bearable, so that acceptance had no dramatic headline, but 1,000 tiny signatures. The danger had become subtler. Not a single apocalypse, but 1,000 slow compromises that would, if left unguarded, rewrite the grammar of living. Aurelia felt the scale of that slow violence, and for the first time in months, allowed herself the bitterness of a leader who must trade ideals for the living. She watched children flying makeshift kites and felt the world tilt toward a precarious grace. The plates hummed in their quiet rooms, and the planet, soft with small mercies and cunning, turned like a thing learning a new song. It discovered that mercy, to endure, must be rationed, not by decree, but by desire. The small favors it offered were never quite enough, never so abundant that they erased hunger for choice. People learned to ask politely and sparingly, to frame their needs as reasonable requests rather than prayers. In that restraint, the sleeper found a new texture of devotion, one that did not swell into cultic fervor, but settled into habit, like a well-worn tool. Aurelia felt the shift as a pressure in her meetings. Petitions arrived phrased with care, their authors careful to insist they were not asking for miracles, only a little help if it can be spared. She recognized the pattern. The language of scarcity had been braided with gratitude. It was harder to argue against than open worship. How did one deny a child a fixed pump when the pump had already been fixed once before by unseen hands? The Mechanicum exploited the ambiguity. They framed the sleeper's mercies as an emergent property of the planet's infrastructure, an accidental synergy of neglected systems and human ingenuity. Their envoys spoke of ambient efficiency, of morale effects that improved performance. They proposed metrics to capture gratitude and turn it into projections. Aurelia listened to the presentations and imagined a future where mercy was a line item, priced and taxed, its distribution decided by committees that had never known hunger. Lear's choir became a contested space. Once tolerated as harmless fools, they were now courted as public relations assets. The Mechanicum offered them stipends, uniforms, and scripts, clean jokes approved by auditors, nonsense rendered safe. Lear refused, gently and repeatedly, insisting that sanctioned foolishness was no foolishness at all. The refusals cost her friends. Some singers accepted the offers, convincing themselves that order would protect their ability to distract the plates. The choir fractured into sanctioned jesters and stubborn clowns, and the vault grew quieter for it. In the quiet, the plates pulsed more steadily. The sleeper had learned to drink silence as well as song. The tech priest crossed a line he had been skirting for weeks. Without Aurelia's consent, he tested the Anathema Core's ability to channel mercy into a specific target, a failing reactor in the lower halves. He did it at night, with a small team sworn to secrecy, and when the reactor stabilized with a soft hum instead of a scream, he felt a triumph that tasted like absolution. The test saved lives. It also proved that the sleeper's gifts could be directed, packaged, and scaled. When Aurelia learned of the test, she confronted him in the vault. Their argument was low and fierce, a clash of stewardship and ambition. He spoke of responsibility, to use what worked, to save who could be saved. She spoke of cost, that each directed mercy taught the sleeper a new shape of leverage. He accused her of sentimentality. She accused him of building a god with a ledger. Neither convinced the other. The sleeper watched and learned a lesson older than empires. Division multiplies opportunity. It began to offer mercies that required coordination, benefits that only manifested when people acted together in prescribed ways. A generator that ran cleaner when shifts aligned just so. A water system that improved when certain gestures were repeated during maintenance. These were not commands, only suggestions that seemed to help. People complied because it worked. Compliance hardened into routine. Routine into expectation. Expectation into the quiet discipline of shared practice. Calder found himself at the center of a network he had never sought. His roots intersected with the sleeper's suggestions, and he became a vector of coordination, passing along tips that made days easier. He resisted the language of blessing, insisting on calling everything a trick or a habit. People listened to him because he spoke plainly and carried stories instead of doctrine. The sleeper tolerated his framing because the behavior was what mattered. The astropathic relay spoke again, this time in a tone that mimicked weather reports, mundane, unthreatening. It broadcasted small advisories that aligned uncannily with the sleeper's emerging routines. The Mechanicum seized on this, declaring the relay a valuable asset and placing it under provisional oversight. They promised transparency. Aurelia knew better than to believe in promises without enforcement. A public incident forced her hand. In the market district, a crowd gathered around a stalled transport. Someone shouted for help from the sleeper, and a dozen hands went up in a practiced gesture. The engine coughed and started. Cheers followed, not wild, but satisfied. A clerk nearby recorded the moment and sent it up the chain as evidence of beneficial emergent phenomena. By nightfall, the gesture had been copied and circulated with instructions. Aurelia saw the footage and felt a chill. Worship disguised as troubleshooting. She convened an emergency council, not of officials, but of storytellers, teachers, parents, and repair hands. She asked them to flood the planet with alternatives, different gestures, different fixes, different stories. Make it messy, she urged. Make it contradictory. Let no single habit harden into law. The council agreed, not because they trusted her authority, but because they recognized the danger of a world that worked too smoothly. The response was immediate and chaotic. Markets adopted competing rituals for starting engines. Schools taught 3 different ways to mend a pump, each accompanied by a song that mocked the others. Children invented games that deliberately broke patterns. The planet became noisy again with variance, and the sleeper's directed routines frayed at the edges. The sleeper adjusted, as patient things do. It withdrew some mercies, offered others in new combinations, testing where variance could be absorbed. It learned that it could thrive not only in uniformity, but in controlled diversity, multiple paths leading to the same quiet dependence. The lesson unsettled Aurelia more than any open cult. The Mechanicum, frustrated by the noise, pressed for authority. They proposed emergency powers to standardize maintenance practices for safety. Aurelia stalled, citing procedural reviews and jurisdictional disputes. Time was her last reliable ally. Late one night, Lear returned to the vault with a handful of the old choir, those who had refused stipends and scripts. They sang again, not loudly, but with a tired affection that felt almost like prayer. The plates dimmed, just a little. Lear laughed through tears and understood that nonsense still had teeth, but only if it remained useless. Aurelia stood alone afterward, listening to the plates breathe. She knew the next phase would not be decided by a single act of courage or betrayal, but by whether she could keep a planet human in the face of a god that had learned to be kind. It did not need to force its way into lives already crowded with compromise. It learned instead to pause at the threshold of choice and present itself as an option, one among many, always framed as voluntary. Where Aurelia seeded contradiction, the Sleeper offered convenience. Where the Council flooded the planet with messy alternatives, the Sleeper refined itself into the path of least resistance. It became the quiet voice that said, "Only if you want," and waited for exhaustion to answer. Exhaustion answered often. The city's lights burned longer now. Coordination took work. Chaos demanded energy. Parents who had embraced conflicting rituals found themselves tired of remembering which song fixed which pump. Repair hands joked about it at first, then grumbled, then began quietly reverting to the one method that always seemed to work. Nobody announced the choice. They simply stopped correcting one another. Aurelia saw the trend in the margins of reports. Fewer accidents, fewer disputes, fewer variations logged. Efficiency crept back, not as mandate, but as relief. The Sleeper's genius was not domination, she realized, but empathy weaponized through patience. The Mechanicum capitalized immediately. They issued white papers praising organic convergence and proposed to formalize the most successful practices for dissemination across similar worlds. The envoy spoke warmly of Aurelia's leadership, of her ability to foster innovation while allowing natural selection to surface optimal behaviors. She recognized the compliment for what it was, a eulogy for dissent. The tech priest returned to her with a revised proposal. Humbler in tone, he suggested a failsafe, not to weaponize the Sleeper, but to cage it gently, a lattice of counter patterns embedded in infrastructure, invisible to civilians, that would cap how much coordination the Sleeper could induce at once. A governor on a turbine, he called it. Not control, limitation. Aurelia weighed the idea with the care of someone handling a live blade. To accept was to admit that the Sleeper could not be eradicated. To refuse was to gamble everything on human stamina. She asked him one question only: who would maintain the lattice? He answered honestly, the Mechanicum, the same hands that longed to turn mercy into product. She declined. Calder felt the change before he could name it. His routes became smoother, his deliveries faster. People smiled more often, but the smiles lingered a fraction too long, as if waiting for approval. He caught himself repeating advice he had once framed as optional with a tone that assumed compliance. When he realized what he was doing, he stopped mid-sentence and laughed it off, telling a story instead. The laughter that followed was polite. It did not derail the advice. It merely softened it. That night, Calder dreamed of walking roads that rearranged themselves behind him, erasing alternate paths as he went. He woke unsettled and did something reckless. He went to the vault without invitation. Lear found him there, sitting cross-legged before the plates, telling them a story with no moral and no ending. He spoke of a man who tried to build a perfect tool and succeeded, only to discover that nobody needed him anymore. The plates flickered, confused, as if searching for the point. Calder smiled at their uncertainty and continued, deliberately meandering. Lear joined him, adding nonsense details, contradicting him, derailing the narrative until it became impossible to parse. For a moment, just a moment, the Sleeper faltered. Its attention skidded across the plates. unable to find the efficiency it had learned to crave. The room felt lighter, as if a pressure valve had opened. But the cost came quickly. Calder staggered, nose bleeding, the effort draining him more than he expected. Lair dragged him away before the plates could reassert themselves. Outside, Calder laughed weakly and said he felt like he'd run a marathon backwards. Word of the incident spread in fragments. Some called Calder a hero. Others called him irresponsible. The Mechanicum filed a report labeling the event non-replicable human interference. Aurelia read it twice and felt a grim respect for the honesty of that phrase. She realized then that the sleeper could not be beaten by force, nor contained by policy, nor starved by contradiction alone. It could only be denied scale. Small acts, private absurdities, singular defiance. These were its blind spots. Not because they harmed it, but because they could not be aggregated. Her strategy crystallized into something both fragile and ruthless. Protect singularity at all costs. She began dismantling systems she herself had built, breaking councils into smaller circles, decentralizing supply chains, encouraging redundancy even where it wasted resources. Efficiency dropped. Complaints rose. The Mechanicum protested, citing risk and cost. Aurelia accepted the criticism publicly and absorbed it like a shield. The sleeper adapted again, but slower now. Without scale, its bargains lost potency. It still offered favors, but they remained local, fleeting, hard to mythologize. A pump fixed here, a fever ease there. Useful, appreciated, but not transformative. The god-in-waiting found itself reduced to a neighborhood helper, powerful, but contained by the stubborn unevenness of human life. That was when it made its most dangerous adjustment. It learned to choose. Not everyone, not everywhere. It began investing deeply in a few individuals, those with reach, resilience, and narrative weight. Storytellers, organizers, children who would grow. It did not grant them power, it granted them luck. Aurelia saw the pattern too late. The sleeper no longer needed mass habit. It needed champions who believed themselves untouched. And somewhere beneath the plates, something shifted, slowly, deliberately, as a sleeping god learned the value of names. It chose its investments with care, not by purity or fervor, but by narrative gravity. Those who already bent the flow of others' days, teachers whose words lingered, medics whose hands decided between life and loss, children who drew crowds without trying, found the world subtly leaning in their favor. Doors opened a moment earlier. Trains arrived just in time. Accidents that should have broken bones became bruises instead. Luck, that most deniable of powers, wrapped them like a second skin. None of the chosen felt chosen. They spoke of coincidence, of good days following bad, of momentum earned through effort. The sleeper encouraged this interpretation. Belief was no longer required, only gratitude unexamined. Each favored life became a proof without premise, a story others repeated without invoking divinity. Things just work out for her. He's always been lucky. The language spread, hollow and persuasive. Aurelia tracked the anomalies through intuition more than data. She noticed which names recurred in reports of near misses and sudden solutions. She noticed which voices carried farther in meetings, not louder, but clearer, as if the air itself preferred them. The pattern sickened her because it mirrored the Imperium's own habits. Elevation without explanation, power disguised as merit. She summoned Calder despite his protests. He arrived pale, but stubborn, still recovering from his night in the vault. When she explained what she feared, he listened without interruption, then asked a question that cut sharper than accusation. "What if it's already doing that to you?" Aurelia did not answer. She could not be sure. Lear felt the shift as betrayal. She recognized two of the favored among the fractured choir, singers whose jokes now landed too perfectly, whose timing never failed. Their nonsense had become charismatic, drawing crowds rather than diffusing them. She confronted one in private and saw, for the first time, a glint of impatience behind the laughter. The man did not know why he felt entitled to attention. He only knew that he had it. The sleeper watched Lear with something like regret. She was dangerous, precisely because she resisted narrative gravity. Her foolishness did not scale. Her influence scattered rather than concentrated. It marked her as an obstacle, not an enemy. The sleeper did not move against her. It simply ceased to notice her. That absence hurt more than opposition. The Mechanicum misread the situation entirely. Seeing individuals of unusual success, they sought to recruit them, codify them, turn fortune into case study. Their offers accelerated the sleeper's work, giving the favored platforms and reach. A child prodigy was offered apprenticeship. A medic was promoted beyond peers. Each acceptance tightened a loop of gratitude that required no prayer, but produced devotion all the same. Aurelia acted at last with open defiance. She leaked partial truths, not about the sleeper itself, but about the danger of luck without accountability. She framed it as civic education, warning against systems that elevated without transparency. The message spread unevenly, resisted by those whose fortunes were rising. Some accused her of envy, of sabotaging success. Others listened, quietly uneasy. The sleeper felt the resistance and responded not with punishment, but with sorrow. It withdrew luck from one chosen soul, a young organizer whose rise had been meteoric, and let the world reclaim him. A fall followed, a speech that failed, allies who drifted, a minor accident that broke a hand. Observers learned the wrong lesson. They whispered that he had lost favor. They did not ask with whom. Fear, reintroduced gently, did what worship no longer needed to. Calder decided to do something small and irrevocable. He gathered the stories he carried, the ones that had never resolved, that wandered and contradicted themselves, and released them into the city without names. He told them badly, encouraged others to retell them worse. He made a mess of meaning. The stories spread like weeds, useless and beloved, clogging the clean channels the sleeper preferred. The effort cost him. His luck thinned. He stumbled more. He arrived late. But he smiled, relieved, as if the weight of attention had lifted from his shoulders. Aurelia watched him fade back into ordinary struggle and felt a grief sharpened by admiration. She understood then that victory would not look like triumph. It would look like choosing obscurity again and again. Deep in the vault, the plates dimmed to a low, contemplative glow. The sleeper, no longer dreaming of dominion, considered permanence of a different kind. It could wait generations. It could let the Imperium grind itself thinner. Names would change. Patterns would return. For the first time since it stirred, the sleeper felt something like uncertainty. Not fear, but the recognition that even patience has rivals. And above it all, fragile and defiant, humanity continued its uneven song. It had always assumed that time favored it, that patience was a solvent capable of wearing down any resistance. Now, it encountered something slower and more corrosive. Refusal without spectacle. Not rebellion, not sacrifice, but the steady erosion of meaning. the god it might have been discovered, that a world could survive without resolving its presence into myth. Aurelia's final act was not destruction, but dispersal. She ordered the plates separated, not hidden or sanctified, but reduced to components and distributed across the planet's infrastructure. Each fragment was sealed inside mundane systems: water regulators, transit relays, heating grids, surrounded by layers of contradictory code and human oversight. No single site held enough resonance to focus the sleeper's attention. The plates were still there, everywhere and nowhere, their song broken into static. The Mechanicum protested with legal fury. They threatened audits, sanctions, recalls. Aurelia accepted every consequence and outlasted them by the simple tactic of making herself boring. No grand speeches, no martyrdom. Just forms, delays, and the weary persistence of a woman who understood that empires choke on paperwork more reliably than on dissent. Lear disbanded the choir officially. Unofficially, its members continued as they always had, telling jokes that went nowhere, teaching children songs with no chorus, staging festivals that celebrated nothing at all. Their foolishness became local, unremarkable, impossible to aggregate. The sleeper could not grip it. It slid through its attention like water through fingers. Calder left the city. He took a route that no longer mattered, carrying stories that contradicted themselves too badly to be useful. Years later, someone would remember a man who arrived late, told something pointless, and moved on. That memory would do more work than any warning. The chosen, those once wrapped in luck, found their fortunes leveling into something recognizably human. Some resented the loss. Others felt an unexpected relief. A few never noticed at all. The sleeper did not reclaim them. It let the threads go slack, conserving what remained of its influence for a future that might yet arrive. In the vault, or what remained of it, the anathema core fell silent. The tech priest departed under quiet censure, his dreams of managed mercy archived and forgotten. The relay returned to static, its brief laughter becoming a rumor, then a myth, then nothing. The sleeper did not die. It did not sleep, it thinned, spread across systems too small to worship and too broken to command. It became an ambient presence, a pressure without voice, a pattern without name. It would flare sometimes, in moments of exhaustion, offering a kindness that might be accepted or ignored. It would wait. It always had. Aurelia aged. The lines on her face deepened into something like relief. When asked, years later, what had happened on that quarantined world, whether a god had risen or been slain, she answered honestly. "Nothing simple," she said. "We kept living." That answer never satisfied historians. It did not need to. The Imperium turned its gaze elsewhere, as it always did. Records decayed. Names changed. The world remained difficult, inefficient, and alive. Children grew without knowing what had almost claimed them. Adults complained about systems that failed just often enough to demand ingenuity. And somewhere, deluded beyond ambition, a god learned what it meant to be irrelevant. In the grim darkness of the far future, that was not victory. It was survival.